Good evening. Good evening. Well, that's nice. I'll do it again. Good evening. Thank you for all being here this evening. I'm very, very grateful at the turnout. We always try to sell more, place more folks than actually arrive because we know some folks stayed home. So if you ever see that thing says sold out, just come anyhow because we'll probably have some room for you. My name is Peter Laporte. I'm the Executive Director of the St. Mary's County Historical Society, and thank you for coming this evening. We are very pleased at our Historically Speaking series that we do in concert or in collaboration with the Center for the Study of Democracy, whose director is back there, Tony Uguez. And they've been partnering with us, I guess, since 2020, in the middle of COVID. And we've done about 14 or 15 of these programs together, and are just very grateful for the relationship that we have with Tony, with the CSD, and with St. Mary's College of Maryland overall. I'd like to ask just one question of all of you: for whom is this your first time to come to Historically Speaking? And oh, good. Well, that's wonderful. And in addition to coming, you cannot leave without filling out a membership application. That's the price of departure. The price of entry is absolutely free. So let's get right to this evening's program. And I'm glad you're all here because I know nothing about, or very little about, Maryland politics. But Professor Charles, or as we call him, Chuck Holden, absolutely does. He's been a history professor at St. Mary's College of Maryland since 1999. He did his PhD in U.S. history back in 1997 at Penn State University. He's written a lot. I was reading your biography earlier today, Chuck, and it's no kidding. If you conclude all of the things he's done and the awards he's received and the publications, and 13 pages long. Now, I have a feeling they either hire you after the 4th page or you don't get hired at all, because 13 pages is simply too much to read through. But in any case, in 2002, he published a book called In the Great Maelstrom, Conservatives and Post-Civil War, South Carolina. In 2011, he published the Southern University Academic Freedom and Liberalism at the University of North Carolina. And he's the co-author of Republican populist Spiro Agnew and the Origin of Donald Trump's America, which he published in 2019, and that obviously is the subject for today. His op-eds have appeared in the Washington Post, the Baltimore Sun, the Charlotte Observer, the Des Moines Register, and the History News Network. As I said, I'll stop there. If you'd like his resume, it is on the website, on the college website, and it's a good read. I was telling Chuck a little bit earlier, I have in every instance where we have invited an academic, I've gone to rate my professor, and just to see what their students say about him. Now, I understand a couple of the students that he may have are here this evening. Wonderful. So I'll be looking for your names. But it is interesting that out of 27 out of 28 students on Rate My Professor gave him an overall rating of 4.7, which means either great or excellent. Hold on, there's more. It's only 4.7. All of those were 5.0 ratings. However, one student rated him sort of as just okay, and called Professor Dr. Holden as the toughest history professor at Southern Maryland College, St. Mary's College of Maryland. Now, I suspect that when he saw that, his view of that student might have been similar to that of Spiro Agnew's, speaking on a different subject. And to paraphrase Spiro, that student was a nattering nabob of negativism who has his own 4-H club of hopeless, hysterical hypochondriac of history. And with that, please welcome. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Peter, for the invitation. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Good evening. I do see some students and former students here. There not have been you on that. I was telling Peter beforehand, I'm happy to be invited, of course. And as he mentioned, our book on Agnew came out in 2019, and as we do, we move on to other projects. So it's been fun to kind of get back into Agnew a bit here, because he, as an academic, he's kind of been the gift that keeps on giving, which is always nice. There always seems to be more to learn about him. So tonight, what I'm really looking at more is his legacy on our national political culture. So let me just dive in then. His speaking style was described as often inaccurate and dangerous. The editor of Time magazine considered him deeply unworthy to ascend to the presidency because he was a narrow, quote, a narrow and dangerous man with a genuine capacity for bigotry. He attacked the press, what he called the big city liberal media, and bragged about launching a crusade against what he called their intellectual dishonesty. This was Spiro Agnew in 1969. Largely forgotten now, Spiro Agnew is always on the attack, never concede an inch, reject all criticism, political style, helped pave the way for a different kind of Republican Party, and ultimately a different kind of Republican president, and now it appears a new kind of Republican vice president as well.
Stay still.
Conservative commentator Mona Charen on a podcast last fall said of Donald Trump, he doesn't have an ideology, he has a mood. Agnew was instrumental in making right-wing politics about mood, about temperament, more than a belief in, say, small government, or a balanced budget, or a strong defense.
Okay, you can move it if you want.
Spiro Agnew was born in Baltimore City in November 1918. There he is as governor of Maryland, speaking at St. Mary's College. He was the son of a Greek immigrant father who at various times ran a restaurant, a grocery store, even a candy store. Agnew's early years are noteworthy only in that very few of his fellow students seem to have any memory of him at all. He dropped out of Johns Hopkins after admittedly not trying very hard. But Agnew served honorably in World War II. He fought at the Battle of the Bulge, 2nd Lieutenant, 54th Armored Infantry. After the war, Agnew finished his law degree by going to night school at the University of Baltimore.
Okay.
He did it the hard way.
Okay, good.
He moved out to the suburbs of Baltimore County after the war, where he opened a small law practice at Towson, and where he, like so many others of the post-war generation, embraced the middle-class life of the 1950s. He belonged to the PTA. He joined the Kiwanis. He read Reader's Digest, which was the voice of sort of Cold War middle class. He took up golf. He loved ping pong. And he followed the Baltimore Colts with a passion. He was the father of 4 children and husband to stay-at-home wife Judy. One of his many admirers later wrote to Agnew and likened himself to the vice president as one of the conservative, hardworking, middle-class, reasonably normal people. Or, as Richard Nixon would call them, the silent majority. Our book is titled Republican Populism. So how do we link this white, suburban, middle-class dad with populism? The historian Michael Kazin gives a concise definition of a populist as one who, putting Kazin here, convinces people that you understand their resentment of the elites. To Kazin, populism is more an impulse than an ideology, mood. temperament. And this fits Agnew to a T. In the mid to late 1960s especially, when Agnew's fame took off, it increasingly became the white, middle, and working class, Agnew's neighbors, in other words, the reasonably normal people, as they saw themselves, who felt growing resentment against some notion of the elite. For them, the elite might mean a political elite who ignored their concerns. People unhappy in the late 60s, for example, with the early years of affirmative action. The elite also came to mean for them the leaders of academia, especially those who gave their support to those younger people involved in the anti-war movement of the mid and late 1960s. Students who represented a kind of unpatriotic entitlement and ingratitude to their parents' generation.
Okay, you can move if you want.
For these Spiro Agnew / silent majority types, there was resentment against the powerful shapers of public opinion, the press, the media. More on them later. As well as resentment against the shapers of taste, the stars of the counterculture, who instead of being shunned by polite society, seem to have been given a special place in the culture by the leaders of the entertainment industry. Picture a Jim Morrison poster up on your teenage daughter's wall. Jim Morrison and the Doors, selling thousands of records, getting tons of airtime on the radio. Well, there's old Jim himself, long hair, leather pants, staggering around, drunk out of his mind on stage, singing, "Come on, baby, light my fire." Or after you've tried your best to instill good moral values into your children, setting strict guidelines on dating, for example, you'd hear the same teenage daughter sing along with Crosby, Stills, and Nash. And if you can't be with the one you love, or the Rolling Stones, role models to a man, and their 1968 hit, "Sympathy for the Devil." Well, there's a lovely message. In 1970, Time magazine announced as their Man and Woman of the Year, the Middle Americans. They wrote, "Everywhere they flew the colors of assertive patriots. Their car windows were plastered with American flag decals, their ideological totems. In the bumper sticker dialogue of the freeways, they answered, 'Make love, not war,' with 'Honor America,' or 'Spiro is my hero.' They feared," this is still Time magazine, "they feared that they were beginning to lose their grip on the country. Others seemed to be taking over. The liberals, the radicals, the defiant young, a communications industry that often believed was lying to them."
All right, Mary, stay still, okay?
Let's dig a little deeper into this middle-class sense of unease as the 1960s unfolded. There was also in this silent majority a kind of quiet resentment at the peer pressure built into the growing consumer culture of the post-World War II years. The pressure to obtain those material comforts that identified them as being in the middle class. To own a car, 2 cars, television,
Okay, you can move.
washer and dryer, and moreover to have the right car, and the right television, and the right washer and dryer. You work all day, come home exhausted, only to hear, "Did you know that the Andersons bought a color television?" Keeping up with the Jones then was already by the mid-1900s slang for this kind of peer pressure-driven consumerism. Campaigning for the Democrats in the 1966 midterms, Bobby Kennedy observed of the crowds, he said, "They now have cars. They can get to the rallies. You can schedule the rally in a parking lot of a shopping center. And they're all very comfortable. Bobby Kennedy said. You get the sense talking to them that the major thing they're worried about is any threat to that comfort. So, while on the outside, the middle-class happy days experience of the 50s and 60s looked very comfortable, to use Bobby Kennedy's word, a life of automobiles and shopping centers, for many of these middle-class strivers up the socioeconomic ladder, again, like Agnew's neighbors, life often felt precarious, unstable. Sociologist of the time, a man named William White, observed this, and he said that in this dawning sort of middle-class world of consumerism, White said, that somewhere, and I'm quoting, somewhere lies the good life, but it vanishes as quickly as one finds it. Responding to these anxieties then, Agnew, especially as vice president, positioned himself as the spokesman for this taken for granted, increasingly put upon, in their opinion, white middle class. Agnew's populism, as he took on the anti-war movement, academia, counterculture, was then echoed back to him in the thousands of letters of support, and no, I'm not exaggerating, he received from what one of his admirers called the oppressed majority of middle-class, normal Americans who shared his resentment and his frustrations. An oppressed majority. That's a fascinating concept, isn't it? Let me give you some examples of these letters. And believe me, they're all in the Hornbeck Library up at the College Park, and I've read most of them. It's just folder after folder after folder after folder. Here are some examples. One wrote, "You are speaking for all of us middle-class forgotten people. We love our country and our party. We now have someone speaking for all of us." Another one wrote, "I may be a nobody American, but I would help you in any way I could." And still another, "In these truly unsettling times, it is hard to know to whom we, conservative middle-class strugglers, can turn for a fair shake. And we want you to know, for what little it may be worth, that our faith is with you. You are our last hope." Spiro Agnew. What I'd like to do now is show how this political style of Agnew's became popularized while serving as Nixon's vice president.
Still again, I'm going to move the camera.
Spiro Agnew was tapped to become Richard Nixon's running mate in 1968 with no national level experience in politics. He'd been Baltimore County executive for 4 years in the early 60s. He then served as Maryland's governor for only about a year and a half, roughly, before Richard Nixon, made the dramatic choice. That's not it. There's Nixon jumping off a car. Right? Agnew's nomination in the August of 1968 was met with a resounding Spiro who? But Richard Nixon wasn't interested in Agnew's experience or troubled by the lack of it. He liked Agnew's style. He liked his political temperament. Our research showed then that Agnew had a political style, a temperament, already forged before he became Nixon's running mate. So let me back up briefly. Agnew in the late 1950s sat on the Baltimore County Board of Appeals. This is the board that deals with things like zoning disputes. In 1961, the Baltimore County Council, all Democrats, declined to reappoint him to the board. While Agnew blamed naked partisanship for his removal, which was probably the case, frankly, right? He also portrayed himself as the victim of darker forces. He positioned himself as the aggrieved warrior for justice against the corrupt local elite. He hinted at conspiracy and charged that an underground campaign had been waged against him. Yeah, it doesn't seem to have been underground at all. They're pretty clear about, hey, is he out? Yeah, okay, he's out, right? Nonetheless, he insisted that the local democratic power structure was, he said, afraid they can't control me. But he said, I'm not going to lie down and take it. Zoning, right? In the final public meeting where his removal was made official, people nearly came to blows. Right? So what? In just this one local episode, Agnew showed an ability to stir passions, to get under people's skin, to excite those who loved that he lashed out against those in power, and his ability to play, as we would say, the victim card. Now, a turning point in Agnew's career then came amid the tragic days of early April in 1968 and the unrest after Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination. On April 11, 1968, now Maryland's governor, Agnew met with Baltimore's African-American leaders as the widespread protests in the city continued into yet another day. Around 100 African-American leaders gathered for what they thought was going to be a dialogue with the governor. Instead, Agnew attacked them for having failed to push back against the radicalism of groups like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, Civil Rights Organization. Right? But consider the optics of this meeting, which was televised, I should add. Sitting in front of the room, surrounded by the Baltimore City Police Commissioner, who's white, the head of the Maryland National Guard, also white, and the head of the Maryland State Police, also white. Agnew pointed at his audience and charged that it was, he said, the silence of most of you here today, in the face of those radicals, that led to the city's unrest. Now, Agnew says, parts of our cities lie in ruins. In other words, he was blaming them.
You're coming up on 22 minutes.
Those in attendance began to leave in protest almost immediately. Just, right? To be lectured to and to be blamed at this particular moment, in this particular setting,
the camera.
was just more than they were willing to accept. Okay? Tellingly, for what we call the backlash years of the late 60s, Agnew's office reported that the positive reaction to his comments overwhelmed the negative. By one count, he said he received over 1,100 letters of support to just 69 opposed. The letters to the editor of the Baltimore Sun also revealed approval with Agnew's remarks. One said, "We're proud to be Republicans." Another one said, "I'm thankful to hear that the white people will have a strong voice in the government." As this conflict unfolded then, a young political staffer named Pat Buchanan began to feed this new information on Agnew to his boss, Richard Nixon. Nixon was in the process of rehabilitating his career after his defeat to John F. Kennedy in 1960. By 1968, Nixon had emerged as the clear frontrunner for the Republican nomination. But a surprising development, however, in that year was the rise of Alabama's George Wallace as an independent candidate in 1968. Heading into the fall campaign, Wallace's polling numbers were as high as 21%. This is a three-way race, so 21% is not bad. Using George Wallace, after all, using bombast and rabble-rousing, the old segregationist was appealing to the anti-civil rights, anti-Great Society, pro-Vietnam War voter that Nixon had to have. But Nixon wanted to maintain the statesman-like image that he'd worked so hard to create after losing to JFK.
Okay, you can move.
So, how to appeal to those angry Wallace supporters while still appearing to be above the fray? Pick a running mate that will do it for you. As Pat Buchanan explained later, Agnew then would become, in Buchanan's words, the bayonet of the Nixon administration. Here is a picture of Agnew as a megaphone for Nixon. Same idea. Similar idea. So it was then that Spiro Agnew became the surprise choice for vice president at the Republican National Convention in August. On the campaign trail, Agnew made some apparent missteps. For example, when he was asked if he would campaign in Harlem, Agnew said no. He said, if you've seen one slum, you've seen them all. Now, comments like these were thought to be terrible gaffes. But were they, considering the voters to whom he was appealing? Right? Meanwhile, Agnew's stump speech that fall also played off the radicalism on full display in Chicago of that summer at the Democratic National Convention. This was, as some of you will remember, this was the political convention where Chicago police went on a rampage using tear gas and billy clubs on anti-war protesters outside the convention hall. All of this captured on television with the protesters chanting, "The whole world is watching." So against that backdrop then, Agnew predicted that a Nixon victory, instead of radicalism, right, that with a Nixon victory, America would experience, Agnew said, dull things like patriotism, dull things like a respect for law and order. To student hecklers, Agnew had snappy comebacks. At a Towson event, he went after the college protesters in the crowd as entitled, unpatriotic troublemakers. He sneered at them. He said, they've never done a productive thing in their lives. They take their tactics from Castro, Fidel, and their money from Daddy. Right? Sing, right? Now, in the end, as we know, the Nixon-Agnew team won in a close race over Hubert Humphrey and Edmund Muskie. And here's where we get to Agnew being a different kind of vice president. Shortly into their first term, Nixon made it apparent that he had little interest in Agnew's input on matters of any importance whatsoever. Right? Agnew quickly grew bored and restless. He's faced with the usual vice presidential duties, ribbon cutting and funerals. Agnew decided then that he would use his platform to continue scoring political points against the administration's opponents, real and perceived. In essence, he went back out on the campaign trail. Nixon was fine with this. Go. Right? So beginning in October 1969, then, in their first year, Agnew embarked on a series of rousing, headline-making speeches, very unusual in a sitting vice president at that time. And this is what really then cemented his image as a Republican populist icon. In New Orleans, Jackson, Mississippi, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and finally in Des Moines, Agnew attacked academics, the anti-war movement, media. That's a Republican sign of the day. It was in New Orleans where Agnew mocked the effete core of impudent snobs. Right? This is a reference to the nation's university leaders, who were, in his view, both coddling and getting pushed around by the student radicals of the day. A year later, he would criticize American colleges for having become, and I'm quoting, circus tents and psychiatric centers for the overprivileged, underdisciplined, irresponsible children of the well-to-do. Back in '69 at Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, he lashed out at what he called the so-called peace movement. The anti-war movement was, he claimed, in the hands of avowed anarchists and communists who detest everything about this country and want to destroy it. And, he added ominously, it would be okay to, he said, separate them from our society with no more regret than we should feel over discarding rotten apples from a barrel.
Okay.
Agnew's attacks here really struck a chord. Right? His speeches really struck a chord. When asked about the vice president's standing in his state, Kentucky Governor Louis Nunn replied, popular in my state? Hell yes. I'd say he's more popular than Nixon. Nixon must have loved that, right? But the support Agnew generated had a dark side. Senator J. William Fulbright, Democrat of Arkansas, and a critic of the Vietnam War, reported that his mail now was, quote, heavier than usual with messages of hate and anger. And the reason, he said, was clear. Agnew's speeches. Said Fulbright, I'm now receiving the most threatening and meanest letters I've received since the days of Joe McCarthy. Agnew, meanwhile, crowed that he had, quote, triggered a holy war, he said. I have no regrets. Now on a roll, he and Pat Buchanan, on loan from Nixon's office, eagerly looked to Des Moines to deliver the next shot, this time in the media. Speaking on November 13, 1969, Agnew took the network leaders head on. The immediate context for Agnew's speech was the network's reaction to a recent speech Nixon had delivered on the Vietnam War, in which he announced his Vietnamization program. Right? This was an idea where the Americans were going to turn more of the fighting over to the South Vietnamese army. Okay. Now, in Agnew's view, when the experts on TV reacted coolly to Nixon's plan, it automatically proved their bias against the president. The speech, said Agnew, was, he said, subjected to instant analysis and querulous criticism, as the TV audience, he said, was inherited by a small band of self-appointed analysts. Agnew said it was obvious that their minds were made up in advance, that they would not like Nixon's speech, in other words. Agnew then, in the same Des Moines speech, lashed out at the power, he said, of this little group of men who wielded such influence over the news. At the center of that power, Agnew found, he said, a tiny and closed fraternity of privileged men elected by no one. Appealing to his base, he charged that to a man, these commentators and producers live and work in the intellectual confines of Washington, D.C. or New York City. But, Agnew proclaimed, the views of this fraternity do not represent the views of America. Alarmed, the presidents of NBC and CBS both accused Agnew of threatening censorship. The Nixon White House was delighted. Pat Buchanan recalled seeing Agnew on Air Force 2 the next day. Said Buchanan, he walked back to my seat, reached out his hand, and with a huge grin boomed, "Gangbusters." But at least one journalist saw from the beginning how Nixon and Agnew had successfully manufactured this issue. The Des Moines Register's Washington, D.C. correspondent, a man named Richard Wilson, characterized the administration's anti-media strategy as, he said, bold and calculated. In other words, and this is the key, Agnew was not simply complaining about the press. He and the Nixon White House were turning the allegation that there existed a biased liberal media, an allegation that they had largely manufactured themselves, into a new and devastatingly effective Republican weapon. Right? Indeed, Pat Buchanan recalls how in the run-up to Agnew's Des Moines speech, he wrote a memo to Nixon, right, to send Agnew out to attack the media. Buchanan wrote, the result will be to terrify the networks and to discredit their reporting in the minds of millions. Nixon loved it. In another speech that same year, Agnew shared how he had heard the criticism, right, that went, but you are the vice president. You should choose your language more carefully. Agnew's response was succinct. He said, nonsense. After Agnew's Des Moines speech, the networks and the press generally had to reckon with the utter conviction among a growing number of Americans that any criticism of Nixon, Agnew, Republicans, or conservatives generally was solely the product of a biased liberal media. The Agnew shockwaves, Richard Wilson wrote, the Agnew shockwaves are running through the mass media. And he was right. Even though the early 70s journalism is considered the golden age of reporting, Woodward and Bernstein, right? Richard Wilson was spot on. Already by the 1972 campaign, Timothy Krause of Rolling Stone was reporting, quote, the press has become too weak, frightened, and demoralized to dent the Nixon administration's veneer. The next year, 1973, in an article titled The Price of Agnewism, Ben Bagdikian, formerly of the Washington Post, did an analysis of the press coverage from 1969 to 1973 and concluded, he said, that the Nixon administration's 3-year war against the news media has succeeded. Even as the Watergate story was unfolding, Bagdikian wrote, there had been a, he said, retrogression in news critical of the administration.
You can move if you want.
And, he said, a decline in investigation of apparent wrongdoing when it is likely to anger or embarrass the White House. Bagdikian referenced the power of publishers, he said, and editors, so personally favorable to the president that they do not permit their news columns to press him critically. And he cited, finally, a report that 93% of the newspapers endorsing a presidential candidate in 1972 endorsed Nixon. It was, he concluded, quote, official dogma of the Nixon administration that the news is written by liberal Democrat reporters and heavily biased against Republicans. But for most papers, this is not true. Long forgotten now is just how popular Spiro Agnew was for a time. Pat Buchanan wrote to Nixon during his kind of glory days, he said, Agnew can get more coverage than any vice president in history. Again, Pat Buchanan was excited about this. You do kind of wonder what Nixon felt about it, right? In 1969, Spiro Agnew finished third behind Nixon and Billy Graham in a poll on the most respected man in America. The next year, 1970, Life magazine featured Agnew in a cover story with the vice president standing, arms folded, looking supremely confident, under the headline, right, the voice of the silent majority, Spiro Agnew knows best. A Harris poll, published right after the 1972 election, named Agnew as the leading GOP candidate for 1976. In the end, of course, it was not to be. Agnew's past caught up with him in 1973 when he became the target of a federal investigation, bribery and extortion, during his time as Baltimore County executive and as governor of Maryland. Agnew had been using his office to enrich himself. Turns out that's illegal. Here's the kicker. In fact, Agnew was still receiving payments from local Maryland contractors while he was serving as vice president. These guys would, be told, you gotta go down and see the man. So they'd hop in the VW Parkway, drive to the old executive building, and be shown into the office of the vice president of the United States. They'd slide an envelope full of cash across the desk, and he would put it in there, thank you, well, thanks for stopping by, and off they'd go. I just bribed the vice president of the United States. It's amazing, right? After first issuing full-throated denials and blaming the press, naturally, and in the midst of the Watergate controversy, Agnew then stunned the nation when on October 10, 1973, he appeared in the federal courtroom in Baltimore, pled no contest to one charge of tax evasion. It was then announced that he had resigned as vice president, making some people happy. I don't know if you can see that. Former VP Spiro Agnew, you big dope. Right? Sincerely, right? I actually tried to look this guy up to see if if there's any chance he might be. Historians, we have the nosiest people in the world. We will hunt you down. All right. Now, right? Again, these letters are a minority compared to the letters of support, even at this hour, even at this time, right? The letters of support continue to pour in, right? Right? Even when the evidence, right, suggested that he was really guilty. Thousands of supportive letters, right? One of the consistent themes urged Agnew to keep on fighting, fight, right? As they tried to make sense, as the supporters tried to make sense of what had happened, they blamed the media, not surprisingly, given how Agnew rocketed into fame. One letter said, it seems the press and the news media finally managed to accomplish their purpose. The liberal leftists have won by your resignation. Same writer added for good measure, the Democrats, and I'm quoting, are really not good Americans. They're only Democrats who are destroying America. Many simply remained in denial, right? Which makes sense. If one believes that the media is under the control of the liberals, why would they accept, right, what the same media pointed to as facts against Agnew? Okay? The facts actually came from the Justice Department, right, then reported through the media. That was sort of beside the point. As Agnew's legal troubles became known, one woman wrote that she and her husband, talk about denial, don't believe a word that has been said or printed about you. She insisted that she still believed Agnew was, quote, completely honest. She continued, something should be done about the press. They tried and convicted you. Of course, most of them are liberals. Another couple proclaimed, we will never believe you are guilty of the allegations made against you. And still another wrote of the bad news surrounding Agnew, I can honestly say, I have not believed a word. In the end, of course, it was not the media, but the undisputed evidence of Agnew's criminality that drove him from office. And the investigation was led by a team of Republicans. The Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, who gave the green light into the investigation, was a Republican. One of the leading federal investigators into Agnew, George Bell, brother of a Republican senator from Maryland, Glenn Bell Jr. Nixon's Solicitor General, Robert Bork, also a Republican, said that Agnew's guilt was so clear he deserved to go to jail. Sometimes the tedium in the archives are livened up when you stumble upon stuff like this. With his meteoric career in shambles, Agnew was to a large extent ghosted from history. And in the end, Spiro Agnew's commitment to the hardworking, normal people of the silent majority turned out to be a mile wide and an inch deep. In an interview that one of my co-authors, Zach Massetti, and I did years later with Ben Bradley and Richard Cohen of the Post, Cohen recalled how the same Agnew who championed the virtues of patriotism and hard work, said Cohen, shook down everybody for money. Cohen said he was shameless. Behind the scenes, Agnew was desperate to join the ranks of the rich and powerful and leave middle America and the silent majority far behind. He became pals and borrowed money from Frank Sinatra. He forged close ties with oil-rich Arab leaders and right-wing dictators. He peddled in anti-Semitic conspiracies from time to time. As Gary Wills concluded, Spiro Agnew was, and I'm quoting, the phoniest populist of them all. But this other part of Agnew's legacy remains significant. It's the legacy of political temperament at times being more important than policy positions or experience in government. It was a temperament or a style carried on by Pat Buchanan in his presidential campaigns of the 1990s, Newt Gingrich in his rise and fall in the 90s, rekindled briefly in the season of Sarah Palin in 2008. Spiro Agnew injected at the highest level of our political system a zero-sum politics of resentment against some notion of an elite that is dismissive of you and your concerns. He helped give rise to a political style based on mocking one's enemies, claiming victimhood, a style that hints at conspiracy and that constantly rejects and denies any and all criticism. To his silent majority followers, Agnew's attacks on the intellectual elite, on the student protesters, on the media, these attacks were exhilarating. It felt good to hear someone push back against these powerful forces for change, forces that seem to be everywhere at the same time and up to no good as far as you and your neighbors were concerned. And if it wasn't some murky elite, then it was some nefarious other, the anti-war movement, the counterculture, the black power movement, who was out to get you and yours. Gary Wills again wrote that Agnew, he said, radiated a shared feeling of being picked on, even at the height of his power and influence. His followers believed that he, like them, was one of life's victims, consciously undone by secret plotters. After his resignation, Agnew vowed that one day he'd have his say again. And perhaps he has. Thank you.
So we'll have some questions if you'd like to ask. We have two handsome guys who will bring microphones to you.
there's a quiz. I'm going to hand that out now.
You didn't say much about Baltimore County before Agnew took over. Wasn't corruption of that sort pretty common by the old Democratic leaders
Right.
in Baltimore
The
County?
federal investigation that got to Agnew didn't start with Agnew. Right, it was starting with some of the previous county leaders who were indeed
Stay on the
Democrats.
speaker.
I don't mean to let him off the...
No, that's right.
It didn't end with him either.
Yeah. And what's and those of you born and raised in Maryland know this better than I do of that time. When they actually began to question him, like, hey, you're taking money. Well, everyone does it. Well, duh, right? Yeah, and then it's well, okay, but it's still illegal. No, you're right. They started this investigation. They weren't going after Agnew, right? They were going after previous county executives, and then
Anderson.
and then Dale Anderson too. And as they began to get people to talk, then cut a deal. Finally, one of them said, "Well, I got a name for you," and that's how they got to Agnew. Richard Cohen tells this great story that it was such a wonderful moment. I mean, for an historian, and Zach has a PhD in poli-sci, but he's an historian.
He's still.
Right? And Bradley and Cohen hadn't thought about Spiro Agnew in years, right? And so they were down at Bradley's place, and so Zach and I went and hung out with them and talked, and they got reminiscing. And the more they got reminiscing, the more they got remembering. And Richard Cohen because Richard Cohen was to the Agnew case what Woodward and Bernstein were to Watergate, right? And he's just, he starts reminiscing. God, I just can't believe how corrupt that guy was. And it was Zach and I are just like, it was great fun. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Professor Holden, Jason Babcock here.
Jason Babcock.
Glad you remember that name. Is it true that Mr. Spiro Agnew was buried in a pretty nondescript grave in, I think, Timonium? That's like no indication he was ever vice president, right?
Yeah, he is. That's right. I haven't actually been there.
Yeah, neither have I.
What's the statement?
Yeah,
What's the statement?
he's buried in a very nondescript grave in Timonium. Jason Babcock, by the way, was one of my very first students at St. Mary's College.
Good to see you again.
Good to see you. I think the last time I might have seen you was during a hurricane when I lived out at near Gate 3. And, well, anyway.
And he would fly by.
Yeah, no, there might have been deers by the shore involved. Because I smiled, I'd never seen a hurricane before. And like a fool, I thought, well, I'm going to go out and look at it, And I go, that's what you do with tornadoes, right? With a tornado, you got to go look at it, right? So I go out, so I go out, it's dark, it turns out they're very windy, right? And there are a bunch of people down there, and I walk up and I hear, Professor Holden. It's like, Jesus. If I remember, there was a beer in each hand.
And they got very hot very quickly in those hurricane winds.
Anyway, it's great to see you.
Good to see you.
I don't mean to monopolize, but what about his almost 2 years as governor? What was it like, and what did he accomplish? Did he fight with the legislature the way Hogan did, or
Yeah,
was
he did, right.
He thought of as a moderate Republican?
He was, right. So, context, right? So he went to the 66 governor's race because the Democrats, for one last time, exactly, nominated kind of an old segregationist. And so, and so Agnew realized, well, all I have to do is be kind of moderate, and he's going to win, and he was right. Right, so it's fascinating to go through the Agnew papers during that time, and you see, stationery for Montgomery County Democrats for Agnew. Right. So so as governor though, he was a little bit like Nixon as president with a Congress that's in the other party. He would kind of pick his fights, But the record left behind would still kind of make him look like a moderate, right? They passed some gun control, they passed a Fair Housing Act, right? And right, so his governorship again kind of made him look fairly moderate, right? I mean, who knows what would happen if he served out his term, right? But no, this is what really caught our eyes, that because at first we were sort of puzzled about how is this, fairly moderate mid-Atlantic governor, right? What is it that Nixon saw in him? And then when we kind of got this idea that it's about the mood, it's about this temperament, then it was like, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
So I'm wondering, that's all right, I'm loud. So I've read a little bit about Spiro Agnew, and it seems like definitely a crook, like the money thing coming across the table. And that doesn't seem very repeatable today, I hope, I don't think. I don't know, like that cash across the table at the White House? I mean,
Like God made Venmo, right?
Okay. But that's not really my question. My question is, how close was he to the presidency? Like,
Oh yeah,
with Watergate looming and all that, like how close was he?
pretty close. Because it's just an unbelievable situation where you have both the president and the vice president, not just under investigation, but like looking pretty serious. The evidence is going to be there. And one of the reasons why Nixon was encouraging the investigation of Agnew.
He was what?
Encouraging it.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
He wanted you
Right.
To deflect from him or what?
Because he knew Agnew was guilty, and he thought, and it's Nixon, right? He thought Agnew was simply not up to the task of being president. Keep in mind, Nixon knew what he had done, right? So Nixon is facing a situation where, my God, I might have to step aside. And I don't want Agnew to be president because he's not up for the task.
Uh-huh.
And so he's encouraging. Go ahead.
Thank God for Gerald Ford, huh?
Yeah.
Wow.
Hardball politics at that level.
Wow.
Yeah. So, but it was a question, So Agnew's trying to delay as much as possible, right? For a while, he wanted he wanted Congress to try and impeach him. He floated this idea that he wanted Congress trying to impeach him so he could have trials, so he could gin up public support, and because he knew he was popular, right? If he could use this kind of delayed, it would be on television, the impeachment of Spiro Agnew, his people, and again, man, his supporters, that would put pressure on Nixon, right? And if he could hold on, right? So Agnew could hold on and Nixon had to resign first, right? Then suddenly the charges against Agnew would probably go away, right? So it was close.
He pardoned himself.
Yeah.
Maybe you can't do that while you're in office.
But what really got him and his attorneys were like, first off, the leaders of Congress were like, we're not going to do that. You're on your own, pal. Good luck in court, right? But they just had him dead to rights, and he got I guess he had to resign as vice president, but it was a $10,000 fine. He got disbarred, 3 years probation on just one count of tax evasion. So he got off pretty light because he was looking at serious jail time. And part of the plea deal was that the investigators said, "Oh, well, okay, we'll agree to this," because at this point, Elliot Richardson wanted Agnew out of the way too. Didn't think much of it. But they said, "But we get to publish our indictment," and it was a big, long indictment. They published the whole thing in the Washington Post, and it's pretty damning. Yeah, they had him dead to rights. Yeah.
So what do you do after this?
Sold.
How do you live without all that bribe money?
He sold, and he, during his time as vice president, he had traveled the world, he had met a lot of people, and he knew a lot of people in Congress, and he became sort of a go-between for foreign businesses who wanted to make contact with American businessmen, right, business owners. And so he, because he had met these people, and he can sort of make introductions, and so he would get a cut right? So that was pretty much his career for the rest of his life. Yeah, and he got, some of his clients were these kind of Arab oil, and that got him into some kind of weird stuff about anti-Semitism. That he late in the 70s and the early 80s, he began to kind of float this idea that his removal was actually a Jewish conspiracy against him. Yeah, I interviewed a young guy who wasn't a young guy in the interview. A guy who at the time was Agnew's driver during when he was governor, and really liked it. And this was Agnew, the dad, the suburban dad who liked to play ping pong and loved the Baltimore Colts. And this guy happened to be Jewish. And so in the late 70s, when Agnew kind of gets called out for floating some of these anti-Semitic conspiracies, Agnew called this guy up and said, you got to come to my defense. You know me, right? You know that I'm not anti-Semitic. And the guy's just like, I don't want any part of this. Yeah. He didn't believe me either. Yes.
Did he have any involvement in the next phase of Maryland politics, or the racetrack issues or anything like that?
Not that I know of. He had 2 homes, Ocean City and in California. But no, he was pretty much persona non grata. Yeah.
One more question. You mentioned the Chicago convention with Democrats chose Humphrey ultimately, with all the chaos. As I recall, the Republican convention was in Miami,
Yes.
and Nixon picked Agnew. Who else was in the running? How did that happen at the convention?
Right. So, remember, one of the things Nixon's trying to do is pull in conservative white Southerners. This is post-Civil Rights Act, post-Voting Rights Act, who are now getting ready to leave the Democratic Party, right? So he wants to find someone who would be okay to these sort of new Republicans coming from the white South, right? So there's, what's his name? Charles Percy was one of the people. Oh gosh, I'm trying to think if there were any Southerners on the short list. I don't think there were, but Strom Thurmond was in the room, right? So Strom Thurmond wouldn't have been on the ticket, but Strom Thurmond was given the yes or no, given the up or down, right? I'm blanking on Percy's the only one that comes to mind. But what they were trying to do is find someone who could kind of fit that middle. There was still the Rockefeller wing of the Republican Party, still fairly liberal, right? But now you have this new conservative part of the wing, especially in the South, and Nixon is trying to find someone who can kind of be the sweet spot in between. And he thought he had him in Agnew, not only kind of, ideologically, that Agnew still did have this reputation of being a moderate, but he's geographically in between, right? So in that sense, it was perfect, he thought. Yeah. But there was actually the smoke-filled room type stuff down at the convention where they're hashing this out, right? And then finally Nixon says, yeah, let's go with Agnew, and they sign on to it.
Was Rogers Morton never considered for? I know he was parliamentarian.
Yeah.
But he fit that kind of same mood.
Yeah. Not that I recall. Like I said, it's been a while since I've been going through the Agnew papers. Right? But it doesn't, not that I remember now. Yeah.
What's your current passion, Professor?
Well. He pulls out a whole other speech.
Well, no, you do this for 5 years or however long you dig in, and now what are you doing?
Yeah, so I anytime you have a book-length project, there is, and some of my students have, done this with their senior thesis, you have way more research than you're able to use, right? And so I had lots of good stuff kind of lying around. And so I continued to kind of write some different articles about Agnew. But then I got, actually this idea, I can't take credit for it, was suggested to me by a couple political scientists that I'd been on a panel with at a conference in Montreal. And they said, we're putting a book together, a collection of essays on the American vice presidency, because it still is a very understudied office in history. And they said, what would you think about writing an essay on the running mate as the attack dog on the ticket, right? Like, that's interesting. And so, and I said, well, I'm a historian, because they're political scientists. How far can I go back? Because they don't want me to go too far back, because they're political scientists, right? And they said, well, how about the 80s? Like, the 80s? That's yesterday for me.
You mean the 1880s?
Yeah. So I said, okay. So I started looking into it, and I, just real sophisticated research, pulled up the New York Times database and searched attack dog, right? And it turns out it was not a term of art in politics until the 1980s. Who knew, right? And it wasn't then applied to the running mate until like the 1990s, which just shocked me. And so then I got thinking, well, what are they doing then if they're not the attack dog, right? And so what I'm working on is how between 1988 and 2008, the role of the running mate has shifted, right? That at first, coming out of the 70s and 80s, the running mate was there for perhaps ideological balance or geographic balance or generational balance, St. Dan Quayle and Poppy Bush, right? But the further into the 80s and 90s you go, this idea that no, you've got to be on the attack is sort of added to the list of the to-do list of the running mate. But what's fascinated me so far is that in the 96, 2000, 2004 election, you have a running mate on the ticket, Jack Kemp, Joe Lieberman, and John Edwards Kinda, who say, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to be the running mate. And so then that creates this tension within the campaign, right? And then the tension gets resolved in 2008 when the word is, yes, you are going to do that, right? So both Sarah Palin and Joe Biden, there's no question that part of their job, really the central part of their job as running mate, is go out there and be on the attack, right? Because if you look at it, think about what do Jack Kemp, Joe Lieberman, and John Edwards have in common? They lost. Yeah. So, yeah, that's what I'm working on now. Good stuff. Yeah, hopefully. Yeah. Very cool. Are we good?
We're good.
Thank you, everyone.
That was outstanding. Thank you so much, Dr. Holden. Before you all leave, I want to let you know that we are planning, I haven't even shared it with you, I just found out today, another historically speaking is slated for August 20th, and it's by a woman by the name of Valerie Hall. She's a PhD candidate at the University of Maryland, and she wrote a paper that intrigued me when I came across it. And her topic, and I won't try to give the fullness of what her title will be, but it's about the effect of indigenous women, i.e. Native American women, on the culture and of immigrants in the 17th century to southern Maryland. We often think of the effects that arrivals here had on the indigenous culture, and she has found that there is also a corresponding, perhaps rebound effect on the immigrant culture and arriving here in southern Maryland in the 17th century by and from indigenous women. I think it's going to be a fascinating topic. She's a delightful person. I've talked to her a couple of times on the phone. And I look forward to seeing you all then. And once again, if you're not a member, please do consider joining us. We welcome you. Thank you very much.